Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. My name's Eldon Takitimu. I am a senior associate here in the in the overburdened, the queen of AdTech and the first data mappers, the Khaleesi of CrossFit, the breaker of trainees, and our very own mother of jargons team, but we are supported by a back office of GDPR, 1 year in review. Today, we are going to talk about the GDPR. Obviously, it's the 28th of May, so you've now seen 600 different year in review articles or webinars from our competitors. So we're not going to spend too long on looking backwards. The focus of today's podcast is really going to be looking forward in terms of what we think year 2 and 3 and beyond holds for businesses, what we think the general public and regulators will be focusing on in the coming year. But first, I will do an obligatory wrap-up of the first year of GDPR land. Well, I think it all started with memes. For the first time, privacy got some decent memes. That's how we all knew that we were working in an area of law that was at least topical. And then after the memes, we got the inevitable almost breaking of the internet via people updating their privacy policies and being spammed about the updates of those privacy policies. We saw lots and lots of DPAs. Everyone had a DPA. We've probably seen even more DPOs. It felt like 4 years ago there were DPOs in Germany and then about 3 for the rest of the world. And now I'm told that there's 250,000 DPOs. It seems like it's been a very good year for the IAPP because I think their membership is up by about 6 million %. There are 12,000 new SIPI and SIPMs and all sorts. But outside of that, we did have on May 26th the first GDPR complaint. And then it hasn't really stopped since then. So I think we have an obligatory stats page. So I understand there's been 206,326 reported cases. It's probably up in 300,000 now because we've been using this figure for at least a month. A lot initiated on the basis of data breaches, a lot on the basis of complaints, but probably the figure that I think stands out most there is the 52%, which says that 48% of those cases are unresolved. And as an indicator of how long things are taking to work through the system, you probably saw last week that the Irish DPC announced a full-scale investigation into the ad sales business of Google. The primary complaint that gave rise to that was issued in September last year, so you can take that as an indicator as to how long things are taking to work through the system. And then, of course, there were some fines issued. It looks like a big number there, 56 million. Now I know that most of that was taken up by the 50 million issued by the CNIL on Google. Does anyone here even remember who else got fined?
Well, I know another one. There was a significant fine in Denmark, their first ever fine that the Danish Data Protection Authority, 10 points if anyone can pronounce it, made. It's actually their first fine. I don't know if they had fining powers before GDPR. I know some of the DPAs did not, but anyway, they didn't use them if they had them. First fine, it was 1.2 million krona, which is about 20 quid. No, it's $180,000, so that's around £140,000 for those in the UK. Equivalent number of euros. I'm not quite sure what the exchange rate is these days. Probably pretty rubbish. But the complaint there was about a taxi company, and I'm not sure if it came from a complaint or an audit. The information says audit, but I don't know if that was a proactive one on behalf of the authority. But essentially, a taxi company was found to be holding 9 million records in contravention of its own retention policy. And what it actually had was a load of taxi journey details, and they had the names and the addresses and the GPS location and the price and the phone number, and they got rid of the names and addresses, and they thought that meant they deleted all the data. But the authority said, no, of course, that doesn't mean that. The fact is they were using the phone numbers as account references. So they said, well, we're not using the personal data, it's just the account reference. So our system can't convert phone numbers into random numbers, therefore we have to use the phone number. And the authority, as predicted, just didn't have any patience with that. Said, well, it's not our fault that you have a rubbish computer system. But they described it in terms of Article 5 violations. So that's the principles of the GDPR. And they found it was 3, purpose limitation, i.e. using phone numbers for another purpose. But arguably, I don't think that's that bad because they weren't using them as phone numbers. They were using them as account references. Minimization, I should have got software that could convert numbers into random digits, and also storage limitation because they had a policy and they didn't follow it. In my view, they're quite fundamental things to get wrong. So much like the Keneal case we discussed previously, they said it's absolute failure and therefore it's 50 million. Hard to go above that. This one, they've gone to the heart of GDPR, like the basic principles. They said you've got these totally wrong and fine them $180,000. So that's another chunk of that 5 million or so there, Eldon.
Thank you. A simple yes.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Flick, you were going to...
Yeah, I was going to say, so if we looked at the Google fine, which obviously took up the biggest chunk of that 56 million euros, we know that the regulators can fine up to 4% of global turnover, and if you looked at I'm sure that 50 million euros is not even close to 4% of Google's turnover. So if you looked at the percentage-wise, it wasn't actually that big a fine. But I think some of the real costs of some of these cases is actually in the mopping up that has to be done as a result of them. And that's actually quite an interesting recent case that's come out of Poland, where the Polish regulators have issued a fine of 220,000 euros, which on the face of it is not huge, and that was levied against a company in Sweden because they had failed to go and provide notice to individuals under Article 14. So they'd basically been receiving a whole load of third-party data to then go and market to those individuals, a very common practice if you're doing lead generation or buying in third-party marketing lists. But what they'd failed to do is actually, before marketing to those individuals, go and provide those individuals with the notice that you're required to provide to them under the GDPR. And even though, there were 6 million people that they'd failed to provide notice to, the regulator said, don't care, you have to go out and provide notice to those 6 million people. And it doesn't even matter that you don't have their email address. If you have their postal address, we expect you to go out and put a letter in the post and provide them with the GDPR notice. So on the face of it, €220,000 fine doesn't seem a lot, but when you factor in what has been reported as the real cost of €8 million in going out and actually providing those notices, I think that's where we'll start to see the real cost of some of these, some of the regulatory action. But generally, I think the last year has been interesting because actually we haven't seen a huge amount of regulatory action. They haven't been flexing all the muscle available to them. And if you look at some of the quotes that have come out from the regulators, they've sort of indicated, or certainly indicated, that the last year should kind of be considered a transition year.
A grace period?
Well, I wouldn't call it a grace period, but 25th of May came around last year, and everybody had been rushing to build their privacy compliance programs, kind of switch it on the 25th of May. But what was interesting was that we're dealing with a principled-based piece of legislation, And last year, we were also dealing with a scenario in which we had very limited guidance from the regulators in how to interpret some of those principles. So everyone rushed around trying to put in place their best effort to kind of address compliance, and kind of switched it on, almost blind to what others in the market were also going to do. So what we've seen in the last year is everybody kind of testing out their compliance models, seeing if it's going to work in the market, seeing whether customers are happy to accept what they've put out there to the world. And so everybody's really kind of just been sort of bedding in, trying to understand how it's all going to work in practice, trying to understand and settle out on what is, market practice when it comes to GDPR compliance. And I think the regulators have almost been doing the same. They've been working hard, I think, to, push out the guidance that we're all desperate to see, to staff up, because a lot of them were really understaffed, and also to deal with a lot of the legacy investigations that they were still dealing with pre-GDPR. So whilst we haven't seen a huge amount of regulatory action, I think that's all going to change in the next year. And since we're talking about Game of Thrones, trying to use Game of Thrones references here, I think to a certain extent winter is coming. We've got to bet out who can put the most references in. There's a croissant at stake. So.
Thanks, Your Grace. So that's probably, I'll give you the opportunity, Mark. Any wrap-up comments on year one before?
So, wrap up on year one. I think, we're in danger of falling into the trap that every other article does and thinking the GDPR is all about the fines. And as Flick was saying, it really isn't. The fine is one of the tools in the box of the regulator. Ultimately, they want to drive good data protection practices. And if you think of the fine as the kind of the ultimate stick or ultimate sanction, it did its job in 2016, 2017, because it galvanized so many businesses to think about the GDPR and European privacy in a new way. And I think that's the thing we've all seen as a team. It's not, we're not talking about fines day in, day out with our clients. We're talking about data privacy, protecting data. And there are probably three parts of that. So this new awareness is probably threefold. It's customers that know they need to protect data and want their vendors to protect that data in new ways. So their new awareness and their fears coming out. Consumers know their rights and they're using them. And although we've seen a surge in sort of DCR's access deletion requests early on, they're clearly dropping back a little now as the fun of putting in a DSAR has perhaps gone away for some. But more importantly, and also quite worryingly, there's activists using these rights to affect change. And the DSARs and deletion requests we see right now, the majority that at least come up to us are fishing expeditions, known individuals who are really trying to dig around. And that activism, as we'll see and we'll carry on seeing in this session, is going on to lead to more investigation and more challenges with process. And I think the regulators will always say, if you can't deal with these kind of requests and if you can't deal with explaining what you do, you probably aren't anywhere near being GDPR compliant, whatever GDPR compliant means. So I think we're very early in a long journey here, and maybe the more interesting webinars we'll be running will be GDPR at 5, GDPR at 10, where we start to actually understand some of what this legislation has meant to everybody. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. We've almost seen the weaponization of the data subject rights request, and a lot of the individuals who have gone out and made these requests have used the responses that have come back or not come back as kind of evidence to build complaints against the regulators, and it's those complaints that are now getting prioritized by the regulators. So if you don't get that process right and it leads to a complaint, that's more likely to trip you up than anything, I think, at this point.
Okay. So, I mean, that sounds like a good time to move on to looking forward. It sounds like, if I could wrap up, it sounds like season one of GDPR has been, very much about setting things up for later seasons. It's been punctuated with some action scenes, but generally a lot of the characters are feeling each other out.
Hopefully the final season will be more satisfactory.
I think the heat is coming.
So if we look forward to what we think that regulatory / public focus is, and I don't know, Mark and I were talking off air before the podcast, that we thought that probably more than ever, we think that the regulatory sort of priorities actually align with the concerns you're seeing coming through from individual members of public or data subjects, sometimes fueled by data activism. But if we look now at what their regulatory and public focuses are, I know that the guys want to talk about transparency and consent. I know that we want to talk about tracking, both web and cross-device, and also we also want to pick up on the growing expectation amongst the general public and regulators around those accountability measures, around governance, around data subject rights, which you've already mentioned, you've already heard mentioned, complaints, DPIAs, and all of that good stuff. But if we can start with transparency and consent, now clearly through the Google case and various other ad tech related investigations over the last 12 months, we've seen that consent and transparency or lawful basis are very much going to be key focus areas for the regulator. They have been and they're going to continue to be so. So on the topic of transparency and consent, Flick, where do you see the state of play at the moment, building on what you've already said, and where do you see things heading from at least from a regulator's perspective, and if not a general public's perspective, about how these more sophisticated business models will deal with the issue of transparency and or consent?
Yeah, I think it's no surprise. So the early guidance that came out from the regulators was actually focused on the issues of transparency and consent. So right off the bat, we did all have some, guidance from the regulators in hand. And looking at that guidance, a lot of us lawyers took the view, wow, some of the requirements that they had kind of emphasised in that guidance, for many of us, it felt like it went over and beyond, above what the sort of GDPR on the face of it required. It indicated that the regulators expected things like, well, if you're sharing data with a third party, they should be specifically named if you can. If you've got sources of data, you should be specifically identifying those sources. And so it kind of set a really high bar for what you had to cover in your privacy notices. And then equally, when it came to addressing consent, we know that the GDPR moved the bar forward from what the what the directive required, and this idea that it has to be unambiguous. And no surprises, there have been, the themes of transparency and consent have been recurring in almost all of the complaints and the regulatory action that's been taken over the last year. And I think we're just seeing this trend towards there being a need to think much more carefully about how you're providing information in your privacy policies, and also a trend towards the requirement to be much more specific and granular in the types of information that you're providing, and thinking more carefully about how you're presenting it to individuals. So just having a kind of blanket generic notice in your user interfaces and on your websites with general statements around the kinds of information that you're processing are probably not going to cut it, and we're going to have to think a lot more carefully about, providing specific examples in user-friendly ways and really identifying in a much more specific and granular way what information you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and specifically who you're sharing it with when you can. And we've seen those issues crop up in a number of the complaints that happened over the last year and in the Keneal decision against Google. So, one of the big complaints that's been filed over the last year was that by Privacy International, which is a advocacy group headquartered in London. And they made complaints against 3 of the regulators, so the UK, French and Irish regulators, and they attacked data brokers, 3 ad tech companies and a number of credit monitoring companies. And it seems that the focus on ad tech models, ad brokering models is going to be a big focus for the regulators moving forward. And we've seen in those complaints a number of key issues being flagged. One is if you're buying in or using data from a third party, everyone has to remember that you've still got an obligation to provide notice to the individuals. And that's addressed in Article 13, which says if you've received the data from a third party and not directly from the data subject, you've got to find a way to provide notice to the individual, unless you can rely on a number of very limited exceptions.
14.
Yeah, that's Article 14. And so in practice, that's incredibly challenging in a number of these different models where the data brokers are amassing data from across their network and then trying to sort of relicense it out. And it's the same in an ad tech model where a number of the people, players in the ad tech ecosystem have no direct relationship with individuals, so they're absolutely relying on publishers to get that notice down. And that's kind of proven to be a kind of flawed model because it puts a huge amount of pressure on a publisher's privacy notice to address everybody's notice obligations downstream. So we've seen these sorts of issues getting picked apart in a number of the recent complaints that have been issued. And then the other thing is if you're relying on consent, for it to be valid, we know it has to be specific and informed. And so if you've got, if you've got a sort of more generic consent statement that you're trying to rely on, that again is just not going to cut it. And if you're hoping to rely on that consent to share data with third parties, again, you cannot rely on more general statements that say you will be sharing it with third parties. There is increasing pressure to be much more specific with the information that you're providing people so that they can make informed decisions. And if your consent rate is something, like 95%, you should expect to start to receive questions over whether or not people are genuinely making informed decisions there. And so people really need to revisit their user interfaces, their consent mechanisms, and the notices that they're providing to individuals to check that they're providing sufficient information in a user-friendly way, and not making people take 3 or 4 steps or clicks to get to the information they need, or pre-ticking boxes, or taking people on a spiritual notice and consent journey to try and get the information.
I think that's really important because a number of the complaints we see coming into clients are alleging misuse or simply knee-jerk reactions to delete because they don't understand. And I think that lack of sort of failure to adequately explain what's being done with data is one of those issues. And of course, one of the challenges because for the few who read, you need to be detailed. Of course, we know the majority just click through and move on. So, one of the things we're trapped with GDPR is this kind of inform and sometimes consent model, which is perhaps dated given the amount of data being collected and used. But right now we have no other solutions, and the sort of more innovative ways we can find to explain, not just bury in a policy, put just-in-time notice, give individuals the opportunity to understand in context, then the better your privacy practices are. I think gone are the days where you can just shoo everything into the one privacy policy, bury it, and think that means job's done. It may be because an individual comes to look at that policy, but contextually explaining what's taking place, particularly if you have to obtain a valid consent, is going to be an ongoing challenge for as long as the kind of concepts of like consent are with us under this legislation, and indeed other legislation as we see this move towards other privacy laws.
I think we just all have to get a bit more creative about how we provide our notices. I remember when we started reviewing notices in the run-up to the GDPR, it was quite clear that a lot of people just cut and paste from someone else's privacy notice and sort of just dumped it on their website and sort of moved on, but that's not going to work anymore.
But there is a paradox here I think creative is right, because you're told at one hand to provide all this information, and then at the same time it must be clear and concise. And even the list of information in Article 13 and 14 goes on for a couple of pages. That's not the information itself, that's just the categories of information you have to provide. And you can understand why the average user is not reading this stuff. And so arguably, is it transparent to give them all this stuff if 99% of users don't even bother clicking on it? And we put so much effort into crafting these things, and the regulators give it so much importance. It was the Irish who drafted that transparency guidance, and Helen Dixon came out here to sort of defend a strict approach, and for them it's absolutely fundamental. Like, how can you process any of this stuff unless you're telling people what to do? But then if no one reads it, how are you telling them?
Speaking of something that 99% of users don't read, we've seen the proliferation of cookie banners since the GDPR came into force, obviously coming from a different part of law, the e-privacy directive. How do we think transparency and consent and cookies and the general use of tracking technologies? I take it from speaking off air, we all think that this is going to be something that's going to continue to develop over the next year. Regulators are becoming much more savvy in their understanding of tracking technologies. We've seen both the Dutch and Bavarian issued cookie-related guidance recently. Big growth area for me, I think, it will be we're now seeing regulators apply what's known as the cookie rules to OTT technologies, to smart TVs, to connected devices. Telemetry, of course. And so for anyone who's new, so when we talk about the cookie laws coming out of the e-privacy directive, they're often referred to as the cookie rules, but they actually apply to any automatic retrieval of or storing of information on an end user's device. So, like I said, the most visible display of this has been through the proliferation of cookie banners to obtain that person's consent for the automatic storing or retrieval of information from their browser. But actually the law is drafted in a technology neutral way and applies to far broader set of technologies than just web browsers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is also applies to any information, so not just personal information. So while we're focused in on GDPR, we're always thinking about personal information. You think about any information, the fact I grab you're on your Mac today or you're on your iPhone versus your Samsung, these other small snippets of information that are so easy to grab hold of are caught. And of course, you're gaining access to information stored on that smart TV or that end user device, and that falls within the e-privacy rules. So you need to gain consent, and that will be an informed consent prior to gaining access to that information. So we focused on this a little around cookies when GDPR came in, because people were then applying the new definition of of consent to the cookie collection. But we are seeing that, as you say, the far more pervasive application of these rules. In fact, they're more difficult in most scenarios that we're looking at, certainly in the technology front, than any other scenario. And that's particularly because to get prior consent is one challenge, if you even decide that's what you're going to do. But in order to get consent, you have to inform. So you have to inform about the level of information ahead of the grab. And that usually involves some kind of technological tweak to the user process. So if you just turn on your TV, most people don't want a banner popping up saying, do you want to do this? Here's some information, link away, because it interferes with the experience. But of course, if you're going to get some kind of prior consent, you need to be handing off either to an online interaction or registration or somewhere else in order to get that consent. And it is definitely a challenge. It's also a challenge as those technologies change. So you start to, you may issue the TV 1 month, but 2 months' time you decide you're going to collect other information and have to make changes. And it's a whole area where you could, sort of discount to say there's not much action, there's not much regulatory investigation, and we'll take a risk. But of course, that's not compliance with the law, and it's not really compliant in a way that most people are happy with their risk tolerance, because as we are seeing these investigations and the increased interest in the interplay between GDPR and e-privacy. So undoubtedly a challenge, Eldon, and something we'll see for a while to come. And I suspect towards the end of this, we'll talk about where the privacy regulation may take us, replacing that directive. right now, I mean, who knows what where we're going to end up with that? But there are more exemptions, but not a lot of exemptions or permissions that help you with some of this. This is going to be an ongoing challenge for many in the tech space. So.
Excellent. Any other reflections on tracking or notice and consent?
Well, I see a helpful bullet here about the ICO warning to Washington Post. I think that's probably interesting to briefly discuss. So for those who weren't aware, the Washington Post came up with this 3-tier model where they said you can access it for free, but we're going to track you, or you can pay a small amount and you'll still get some tracking but less, or you can pay for a premium model and you get no tracking whatsoever, but you've got to pay to read the newspaper. But the ICO basically said, no, that doesn't comply with GDPR because we must take utmost account of whether consent is based on access to a service. So it took a quite strict reading, said that's non-compliant, but then also said, but there's pretty much nothing we can do if you ignore our warning because you're based in the States. So I don't know if the Washington Post has an EU representative, but that wasn't really looked at further.
I think the key takeaway there is cookie walls will violate the GDPR, and you have to offer people real choice. And that means they must still be able to access your site if they don't consent to cookies. But what you are able to do, and we've had some decisions from the Dutch or some guidance from the Dutch on this, is that you can effectively say, if you don't consent, you're going to get a sort of poorer version of our site. Or you can pay and have access to a site and not be tracked at all from cookies or have advertising chucked at you. But there must be the option to still access the site, even if the performance of the site might not be as good.
Yeah, but it's an interesting. The Dutch pretty much aligned with the ICO, but then the Austrians said something different, and they basically said you can have a free version with tracking or a paid-for version without tracking, because media has relied on advertising for decades, and on the online space, it's pretty much the only way they're going to fund this stuff. And it's kind of commercially unrealistic for someone to say, oh, you have to offer this stuff for free with no conditions. Like, well, why the hell would they pay all these journalists to write all these stories if they're not getting reimbursed for it? So it's interesting that you hear something from the EDPB says, now it's great, we have one law and it's complied completely consistently and everything in Europe is the same, and already there's cracks where one DPA says one thing and another says actually disagree.
Interesting. Right. Thank you for that. I know that on the slides we have a bullet point on accountability and evidence and compliance, but we're actually going to skip past that because we're going to be talking about that in part 3 about what businesses should be doing in GDPR year 2. But I think before we do move on to what businesses should be doing, it wouldn't be a European podcast if we didn't have a word for Brexit. What is going on with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we kind of joke every time we come on one of these podcasts or I do a webinar that it's probably changed after the hour we've spent. But Brexit, other than a complete meltdown of the UK government and the need to re-elect a leader, we're still in this kind of ever, this constant of we may get a deal, we may get no deal, or we may not exit at all. And I think with the change in leadership, we're probably pushing more towards some kind of exit rather than a new referendum, but or some kind of new choice. But we're all looking at the 31st of October. There was always a chance something would be agreed before then, but I think given the new leadership bids, the fact that summer's coming, we've just had European Parliament elections over the weekend where there's definitely been a small change in the control of that Parliament, and they've got to sort of build some new coalitions and new interests. That we're only looking at delay, so we'll probably be donning our Halloween costumes as we start to get some answers on this. The one thing we do know is if there is likely to be a complete no deal scenario, or a scenario which is sort of less anticipated, that the real difficulty from a privacy perspective is going to be getting personal data from the European Union to the UK. So that's something that we've been planning with a number of clients, but a lot of it is
and
being...
we have a podcast on that topic.
Yeah, which is still current, I guess, even though we thought it would be out of date. I mean, yeah, go back and look at that or listen to that podcast. But I think, in the same way GDPR asks for accountability, the best preparation you can do for Brexit is really understanding your data and understanding your data flows, because that's what you may have to change. And the businesses that don't quite understand where their vendors are or where their data is going are going to be the ones that are more challenged to put something in place. But a lot of uncertainty there, Eldon, and
so you
no real answers.
I was going to say, if you want a Halloween costume suggestion for October, I think a really scary one would be to dress as Boris Johnson in a kind of Prime Minister's role.
Hopefully former Prime Minister by then. Sorry, Phil Fisher has no political leanings, FYI.
Speak to me after.
So you mentioned there's hope of Brexit on 31st of October. Is there any hope of seeing the e-privacy regulation by the 31st of October?
Well, yeah, so e-privacy regulation, that's probably the thing we get more questions on than anything else. And we really don't know. The thing we've been waiting for has been the European Parliament elections, because from that Parliament, which has just been elected and confirmed over the weekend, they will set a legislative agenda. And it really comes down to how those forces align and what they decide they will drive forward. I mean, I think it's clear there's an interest, but there's as many interest in stopping ad tech and tracking as there are in preserving the ability for the internet to fund itself through advertising, and a real clash of personalities and actually also of countries, with some countries, as we understand, like Germany, actually being quite proactive and pro-tracking in some ways, because they realise that Europe has a competitive disadvantage in some online areas already, and they want to be able to preserve that. And it's this kind of double-edged sword, Valerian steel sword, which the European Parliament kind of on Europe deals with. It's effectively, we want to promote technology, but we also want to protect data, and they kind of got to find that happy balance. And at some stage we'll see that. But dates, I don't see us having any determining sort of final agreement, because it's got to go out into trilogue this year. I suspect we may see something in 2020, and then we'll all be thinking about how that comes to fruition in maybe 2022 as a regulation. And some certainty, perhaps some uncertainty for the UK if we have left, because it's somewhat of a timeline I suspect will mirror some of this legislation, but we'll have to wait and see, because that's likely, if we've left the European Union, to be something which won't automatically bind us as a regulation, unless we're in this sort of deal scenario where we're mirroring legislation for a period. But there's some additional uncertainty around that. But most important thing, I think, almost GDPR-like in its impact, so definitely worth keeping an eye on, but I wish we had more answers. So.
Excellent, thank you. So any final comments on public expectations or regulatory expectations before we...
Yeah, I was going to say just one quick comment on that, is that as Mark kind of hinted at in the beginning of the webinar, we've got to remember that the regulators also have powers to come and do audits, and to also compel actions from companies through kind of orders that they can issue. And I think we're going to start to see the regulators take a more proactive monitoring role in terms of companies' compliance. So they've historically, reacted to problems if there's been a data breach or a complaint. But I think we're going to start to see them exercise their audit powers more consistently. And we started to see that. So recently in February, the German regulators on the Safer Internet Day decided to conduct an assessment of 40 websites. So it wasn't that these websites had necessarily done anything wrong to trigger some kind of audit. They just wanted to go out and see and test how these websites were complying with the GDPR, and they focused on, how transparent they were being in their privacy policies, and also looked at their approach to consent. And so that's just the sort of start of things, I think. And so we should expect that regulators are going to start to come and sort of actively monitor.
And on that point, Flick, I saw last week that the Irish regulator DPC has announced they've actually launched 18 investigations of their own volition. So not as a result of complaints, but something they're proactively going out to do. And I've actually seen a little bit of those, and I think when we go into part 2, we'll start to talk about why you might want to be on top of your accountability and things, because when these things come, you find yourself exposed and wanting if you haven't done some of the core.
It's a great segue.
Be ready to explain your privacy story.
For sure. So let's start thinking about that.
Before
Sorry.
We can cut
Continue
that bit
with the segue.
We can't cut it out when it's gone out live.
Yes. So, as we move into year 2 GDPR season 2, GDPR is business as usual. Come to anyone on this. How obviously lots of companies got their exec attention 12 months ago or beforehand. Give us some money to spend on GDPR, big bang project. How are our clients maintaining that executive attention as we move into year 2?
Well, I think they're going to. Well, they are maintaining it because, one of the primary drivers for most of our clients in getting budget for their compliance program was that they found that they could not get their deals over the line unless they were able to demonstrate, a hygiene level of privacy compliance, or even more, and some customers wanted more than that. And so over the last year, though, everybody went to market with their privacy compliance program. They went to market with their DPAs and their story behind their security program and other aspects of their compliance. And a lot of that has, obviously come under much scrutiny over the last year as customers kind of ramped up their due diligence processes. There were a lot more questions at teams around what, privacy they had in place. And so the cracks in those programs, if there were any cracks, it's meant that it's really held up people getting those deals closed. We've seen a huge focus on data processing agreements. And, I can't tell you how many negotiations we've sat in for days trying to close out a simple data processing agreement. And so, I think that will continue to mean that, it gets the board's attention. They will want to understand why the deals haven't closed as quickly as they have in previous years. And so I think that'll be a primary source of kind of, the compliance program getting more funding for the next year to try and iron out some of those cracks and make sure that they're going to market with a smoother, and cleaner story around privacy and a more robust one.
And in terms of those things to spend your money on in year 2 and 3, sounded like when we spoke offline that we'd all noticed a big focus on a shift in regulators relying on things like your data inventory, your Article 30 record, or your DPIAs as sort of primary examples of accountability. I
mean, you just jumped on the word accountability, and I think that's still the key. And in 2 ways, really. I think, it's in some ways, it's not all about Westeros. There are other kingdoms, and we're seeing that there's Brazil, there's CCPA, there's potentially India. So a number of businesses getting pressure to look at other laws and actually, quite quickly looking at too many laws to a point where actually you've got to draw your own benchmarks. And I think the GDPR will become that global benchmark for many, because you can't just dive in. So that's key. But also on the accountability point, we've seen probably 2 key scenarios where businesses have been found wanting. Firstly, in those kind of liquidity events with new funding rounds and with M&A, where the due diligence in relation to those rounds or that M&A has really focused on privacy in a way it hasn't before, and actually justifying what you do with data quite quickly. Having a story about your compliance has actually been quite hard, and I think that will be an increasing kind of focus for some, but also on the the kind of the accountability side, it's all about kind of demonstrating compliance and understanding what you do. The one thing that is actually sadly actually been quite lucrative for us in terms of finding new opportunity, is we're still at the point where compliance is understood by maybe one or two people in an organisation. We're not at a point where everybody has pushed that out and sort of, dare say the word, but operationalised all of their compliance. But you just lose one person, and you almost have to do some of this again unless you've got some good notes and you've got some good maps, and or you either come back to outside counsel who understood it, or you start building that picture again. And CCPA is asking businesses, who am I sharing data with? New vendors coming on board, continue to change the picture. And I think we keep coming back to, some of the, frankly, more boring parts of GDPR. That accountability means, what data have I got and what am I doing with it? And if you can't explain that, you're found wanting in many, many ways. And we've also seen in some of the regulatory investigations that we've been involved in, the first thing the regulators come and do and say, okay, let me see your Article 30 records. Let's see the DPIA for that processing decision. And believe me, they're not the sort of things you want to put together in 48 hours. You want that, that is about demonstrating your understanding. But you need to start to learn how to use that, not only as something you put in your drawer, but something you use day to day. And I know, Flick, you've been very good at keeping those maps and accounts going. So, how are you using those with, we had a chat offline the other day where you were proudly saying you had the picture and all was well.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people in the run up to the 25th of May did a lot of work on their window dressing. So there were privacy policies in place, they've got contracts in place, etc. But I think that there is a huge effort to be done behind the scenes to really comply with what is a kind of living and breathing piece of regulation. It demands constant reevaluation of your compliance, and to do things like keep updating those data maps that you created in the run up to the 25th of May. How has your processing moved on in the year? We all know, particularly in the Silicon Valley, everyone's constantly pushing the boundaries of what they want to do with data, trying to mine it for new insights, to do new crazy interesting analytics projects, or AI, using AI in a new funky way. And so if you never did that baseline in terms of trying to understand exactly what data you had and done a kind of comprehensive data mapping effort, and then put a note in the diary to make sure that you keep updating that map, and also to have in place underlying processes to ensure that you're catching new data use cases as the organisation kind of seeks to expand its processing activities, i.e. you've got some kind of data privacy impact assessment process in place, whether it be a checklist that all the engineers have to just go through to kind of complete to see whether or not they might be using data for new and interesting purposes that you haven't previously addressed in your privacy notice. So it's not just about window dressing. You need to have some processes in place to ensure that you can keep updating your maps, keep updating your privacy notices, catching new use cases. And so a lot of what I've seen is people working to make sure that they're refining and actually implementing those processes. So we all had those great policies that we drafted just to have them in place on the 25th of May. Now it's about actually putting them into practice, and also just building out that culture of privacy within organisations. And I think key to that is making sure you have a really good data inventory and data map, and that you keep updating it.
I think that's really, that building out is really important. Particularly, a number of the businesses we work with are high growth. Sitting here in Silicon Valley, we can talk to somebody one year they've got 100 people, the next year they've got 300, and having something that's scalable is very very important. But to that whole point, it's Flick was saying understand the data, but then you need to understand what you're doing with it, because that will help you with other compliance. Just those principles that are set there in Article 6 of the GDPR about lawfulness and transparency and purpose limitation, minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality. There's more than most businesses can do, even with those core principles in Article 8. And it's realizing that as well as the business being a business sort of growing and maturing, privacy programs also grow and mature, and it's all about being somewhere on a spectrum which works for your organization. Are you more risk-based and off to the left towards less compliant, or are you really maturing out to become a sophisticated business with a very extensive privacy program, and everybody we work with is on different stages of that journey, whether it's taking GDPR and the effort they've done to capitalize and get the BCR because that makes sense for their business, or whether they're actually just going back over what Flick said. We did the outward facing compliance, but now going back internally and thinking about what else we should do. So having a plan and a roadmap within that program is key, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly. I just want to finish on one point here, and that is that we often get asked, everybody is doing all this great work to address privacy compliance, and they want some kind of badge, some sticker, some certificate to say, hey, we are GDPR compliant. Everyone's desperate for that because they feel they've put huge amounts of resource in. And also a board who's now invested in privacy wants to, well, what can we show for it? And unfortunately, we're not at the point yet where we've got any approved codes of conduct or certifications that people kind of rubber stamp their compliance with. But I think you'll start to see it in the day, you'll start to see it in the day-to-day ease of kind of getting your deals over the line. And at some point we'll also, I think, at some point I'm hopeful that there will be some codes of conduct or certifications that people can kind of work towards. But we're not there yet. But in the meantime, I think it's just about, being ready, having the processes in place to ensure that you can sleep at night, get your deals done, and report to the board that you're not going to risk a massive fine.
Yeah, agree. I think the implementation is very important. We've written some fantastic policies for clients, which I'm sure just got put in a drawer somewhere, and that person left, and now they're not doing any of this stuff. And actually, that Danish case I mentioned earlier, they had a policy in place, they just weren't following it, and hence they got fined. I think the other thing, although we said it's not all about fines, it is quite a lot about fines, in that was the key driver to get this stuff, that got the board's attention in the first place. And whilst we haven't seen many huge fines, we know the ICO and the DPC in Ireland, who are two key regulators, have both said they have, Irish one in particular, many investigations at final stage where they've already concluded that the organisation, and bear in mind it's probably a massive tech company if it's in Ireland, has been non-compliant, and they're just discussing the amount of the fine. And they came over here recently and said, late spring, early summer, we should start to see some of these things. So I think we will see another.
Or they might suspend processing. Worse than a fine, they might just say, sorry, you can't do business in Europe.
Stop processing data. Yeah.
But I mean, it's all, as you're seeing, there's a lot to think about with GDPR still, and you can just hear from the way we're sort of buzzing between us, we're all fully engaged in privacy right now. This is definitely time to reflect and kind of look forward. We're trying to look forward as much as we can. And in looking forward, I think it's realising that we kind of don't know much about the GDPR 1 year on. We know a little. We didn't know an awful lot about the GDPR text when we were building up to it, but we all did well, and a lot of businesses spent a lot of time investing in what they do. So we've just got to keep realising that we'll get answers, but there'll be answers to very small topics within this very large piece of legislation. And as I said earlier, it's 5 and it's 10 years, and I suspect at the 10-year anniversary, there'll still be plenty we don't understand about GDPR, but we're more likely to have areas of the GDPR which matter more and areas of the GDPR which don't then matter. So keeping an evaluation of what where the regulatory attention is going to be key, and customers, but also what's good and right, and what businesses should be doing with the data given their size and their general global footprint or their customer footprint.
Keep soldiering on.
Great. Like the Unsullied.
All right, Eldon wins the croissant.
Eldon's eaten the croissant, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, so unless there's any more, I'll wrap it up there. Alex was dying to say something.
No, just we had a couple of questions come in live. We'll put them in some kind of podcast extra.
Yes.
My only final point was, although we kept saying it to clients a couple of years ago, they largely ignored us. Don't view it as an awful compliance burden. Some clients managed to turn GDPR compliance into a positive thing and actually a sales point, and they're in a great position now. So, it's not all bad. And if that's it, I shall bring this to a... No?
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Oh, no, wait. Trail and...
No, we need
Back to Eldon.
We need to plug our YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah.
It's only newly launched, so you don't get to see the hundreds of thousands of hits that we had on our webinars before we launched the channel. But yeah, all of our previous content is available there. There'll be another one of these podcasts in a month or so, but we're also looking to push out more content like this.
And
so
if you are interested in any particular topics,
Yeah,
get in
just
touch with us because we
let us
will
know. We're
respond
running out.
to the request.
Yeah, there's that where you get the invite, that Field Fisher webinars email address. We get that, and if you want to find us, it's just you can search on YouTube for Field Fisher Silicon Valley, and you should get the channel there with all the previous podcasts as well.
Cool.
cheers.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining us.